There's a word that Pope St. John Paul II shared with young people almost constantly in his final years as Pope. To crowds of thousands of people in St. Peter's Square, to over 1 million at World Youth Day, but just as often to singular people, a sick person he visited in their hospital bed, a teenager he met with who was terrified about their future, a stranger that he stopped to bless. He would take their hand, he would look them in the eye, and he would say one word, coraggio, or courage. Now, I must admit that I don't know his intentions in saying this, but I like to believe that he didn't share it as some sort of pep talk or slogan. As with most things, it's important for us to note the context in which St. John Paul would have been sharing this. By the time he was 21 years old, he had buried his entire family. He would go on to survive an assassin's bullet in the same square where he prayed weekly with pilgrims from across the world. And in his last years, the whole world would watch him as his hands trembled from Parkinson's in front of every camera without any way to hide it. So when St. John Paul would offer coraggio, it wasn't a man who had it easy, who was telling the world to just cheer up. It was a man who knew pain and fear intimately, but he told us, the whole church, simply and boldly, that with Christ, fear and pain never have the final word. In our gospel, a Canaanite woman comes after Jesus begging him to heal her daughter. Matthew tells us plainly that he did not say a word in answer to her, just silence. The disciples, they want to send her away, and Jesus finally does speak, and it sounds harsher than silence. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And yet she responds. Our English translations, they flatten it out, saying she cried out, like it happened once. But the Greek word here doesn't actually mean cried out. It means keep crying out, again and again, refusing to let pain or fear or unwantedness be the final word for her. In many ways, she embodies that coraggio mentality that St. John Paul II preached to the church. So maybe that's the first thing that our gospel is asking of us this morning. When we don't get an answer from the Lord, do we keep asking? Now, we all know the language of perseverance. It's popular in self-help books, in TikToks, and in Reels, and we use it to talk about our workouts, about our hard classes and exams, about relationships that might take some work. But there's a difference between believing in perseverance as some concept and actually staying on our knees after a third or a fourth time when it feels like nothing is growing in our life of faith. Of course, I know that faith has its mountains and its valleys. Some of us might be in a valley right now. I suspect a lot of us might be. Maybe silence in our own moments of prayer, or a friend that we're constantly praying for who doesn't come to Mass with us. A roommate or someone that we keep trying to have a real, true conversation with, but it goes nowhere every time. A prayer for our family members that's met with silence. It can be easy in those moments to let silence be the last word. And maybe that's not where we are today. Maybe we're on the mountain and our faith feels solid, alive, and easy. Coraggio is still our word in those moments too, because the temptation when we're on a mountain isn't doubt, it's comfort. It's coasting through faith. Coraggio matters just as much for someone whose faith is strong, because it can inspire us to have courage to give more, to evangelize, and to never get complacent or comfortable. So whether we're in the valley or in the mountain, the call is the same one that Canaanite woman embodies in our gospel today. This Canaanite woman, she doesn't stop. She doesn't let someone else's beliefs or circumstances get the last word. When Jesus tests her with a hard saying about not throwing the children's food to the dogs, she doesn't walk away wounded. She answers him quite frankly, saying, "Even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the master's table." And Jesus' response is the whole gospel in just a few words. "O woman, great is your faith." Notice that the Lord doesn't name some sort of understanding. He names her courage and her faith. And her daughter, we hear, is healed from that very hour. The asking was never the end in itself. Her courage didn't just carry her through the silence, it carried her to what she wanted, what she needed, the healing of her daughter. And if we look at our first reading, we notice that she isn't an exception to God's plan. She's the fulfillment of it. For centuries before she knelt before the Lord in Tyre and Sidon, God told Isaiah that foreigners and people with no claim or no bloodline or birthright who hold to God's own covenant will be brought to his holy mountain. For my house shall be called the house of prayer for all peoples. My friends, that's a promise about every person who is here who doesn't come from a church-going family. Anyone who's ever not quite sure that this thing is really for them, or every one of us who shows up to this chapel more out of habit or doubt than certainty. And St. Paul, in our second readings, writing to the Romans, is looking at his own people who are walking away from the gospel, and yet he, too, refuses to despair over it. He lands on this: the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. God's mercy doesn't expire because someone was slow or hesitant or doesn't seem to get it all the time. Paul says, God has consigned all of us to disobedience, that he may have mercy upon all. A reminder to us that nobody's no is final, because God's yes doesn't run out. And knowing and believing that takes its own kind of courage too. To keep believing about people we've almost given up on, for the Lord's love extends to them too. Now I hope and I pray that when our time on this earth is done and we stand before the good Lord, he looks at each of us in the same way he looked at that Canaanite woman and says those same words: "Great is your faith." And of course, that's not something we earn. We already heard St. Paul tell us that today the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. We don't get to heaven by racking up some sort of coraggio points to pray our way in. But coraggio is what it looks like to actually live inside the gift while we're still here in small daily tasks. It's praying when we're busy or when we don't feel like doing so. It's texting a friend for the third time to check in after 2 silences. It's kneeling back down to pray for someone after months of nothing changing. All of that is grace. None of it earns us those words. It's just what it looks like to believe them. Now, my friends, in a few moments, we're going to do similar to what that Canaanite woman did. We're going to kneel down, and later we will receive the Eucharist at this altar, the Lord himself, answering us far beyond anything we could ever ask for. That's what this altar has always been, a place where coraggio and mercy meets, no matter if we come from a mountain or a valley. Coraggio, great is your faith, not because it's easy or it's certain, but because we keep asking.